The flashing red and blue lights painted my driveway in chaotic color as the police cruiser pulled up. My hands stayed firmly on the wheels of my chair. My service dog Rocky sat by my side, ears perked. I had seen a lot in my life, but watching an angry middle-aged woman in an overpriced floral dress shriek into her phone about how I was a fraud was a first. "He's faking it. You hear me? Faking it." Karen screamed at the 911 dispatcher, jabbing a manicured finger in my direction. "He's perfectly fine. He's just lazy and looking for pity. And that dog is a menace." The two officers stepped out of their vehicle, exchanging a look. One of them, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, exhaled loudly. He didn't seem eager to be here. The other was younger, maybe in his late 20s, but already looked tired of Karen's antics. I could tell right away, this was not the first time they'd dealt with her. "All right, ma'am," the older officer said, walking up. "You called about an emergency?" Karen crossed her arms and huffed. "Yes. That man is a liar. He's pretending to be disabled so he can get special treatment. He's parked in a fire lane and refuses to move." I had to stifle a laugh. She had really done it this time. I turned slightly, glancing at the sign behind me, the very clear and very legal handicapped parking sign. A parking space that the HOA had originally tried to paint over, until I had proven them wrong. The younger cop turned to me. "Sir, are you aware of any issues here?" I took a slow breath, keeping my voice calm. "No issues, officer. Unless you count the last 6 months of harassment, fake violation letters, and now an emergency call because my existence offends someone." Karen gasped as if I had physically struck her. "How dare you? I'm looking out for the community. We don't need slackers bringing down property values." The older cop's face twitched. He looked like he was holding back from saying something he might regret. "Ma'am, do you have any proof that this man is faking his disability?" Karen faltered for just a second. It was quick, but I caught it. Her confidence cracked like thin ice beneath a boot. Well, look at him. He's perfectly healthy. And that dog? That's not a real service animal. He's running around terrifying children." At that moment, Rocky, my 90-pound golden retriever, tilted his head, tongue lolling out, tail wagging slightly. "Yeah, real terrifying." The younger officer rubbed his temple. "Do you have any actual evidence? Or is this just another one of your HOA complaints?" Karen's face turned a shade of red I had never seen on a human being before. "Excuse me? I am the president of this community's HOA. I have the right to enforce rules." I gave a small shrug. "And I have the right to live in peace without being harassed, but here we are." The older officer turned his attention back to me. "Sir, do you have any documentation for your service dog? Medical proof of disability?" I almost laughed again. Of course I did. I had been dealing with HOA nonsense since I moved in. I had learned fast to keep receipts, literally. I reached into my backpack and pulled out a neatly stacked pile of documents. My VA disability papers, the ADA regulations on service animals, and even a few printed out copies of the HOA bylaws, with highlighted sections proving that Karen was, in fact, full of it. The officers glanced over the papers. The younger one nodded. "Looks like everything is in order." Karen let out an inhuman screech. He could have faked those. The older officer's patience finally snapped. He straightened, eyes hard. "Ma'am, making a false emergency call is a criminal offense. We have everything recorded. Unless you have real proof that a crime has been committed, I suggest you stop wasting our time." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She had played this game too many times before, and she was finally realizing that this time she wasn't winning. I decided to go for the final nail in her coffin. "Actually, officer," I said, voice calm but firm, "I do have proof of harassment. Security footage of her repainting my legally designated parking space in the middle of the night, sending fake HOA violations, and even trying to scare my service dog with a broom." The older officer's jaw tensed. "Would you be willing to provide that footage to the authorities?" "Absolutely." Karen took a step back, face pale now. I was just trying to enforce the rules." The younger cop chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, you keep telling yourself that, lady." The officers turned away from me and toward her. "Ma'am, we need to have a discussion." I watched as Karen stumbled over her words, her arrogance crumbling by the second. She had been so confident, so sure that her status as HOA president made her untouchable. But she had forgotten the golden rule. Don't mess with someone who knows the law better than you do. Rocky leaned against my leg, looking up at me as if to say, "Did we win?" I scratched behind his ears and nodded. "Yeah. We won." And this was just the beginning. The air around us felt thick with tension as the officers turned their full attention to Karen. For the first time since this whole ordeal started, she wasn't the one in control. Her mouth kept opening and closing as if she were trying to find a way out, a loophole, an excuse, anything that would turn the situation back in her favor. But there was none. Not this time. The older officer, clearly fed up, crossed his arms. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step over here." He gestured toward the sidewalk away from my driveway. Karen didn't move at first, frozen in place like a malfunctioning robot. When he gestured again, sharper this time, she finally obeyed, her heels clacking against the pavement. She shot me a look that could have melted steel. I simply smiled. The younger officer pulled out his notepad. "You made a 911 call under false pretenses, harassed a disabled resident, and attempted to remove his legally designated parking space. That's quite the list." Karen huffed, crossing her arms like a petulant child. "I was doing my duty as HOA president." The older officer didn't look impressed. "No, ma'am, you were wasting emergency resources and targeting someone based on a disability. That's illegal." Karen's face flushed red again, but this time it wasn't from anger. It was fear. She had always gotten away with her behavior before. People in the neighborhood were too afraid of retaliation to push back against her. But this time she had pushed the wrong person. Her husband, Todd, suddenly appeared at the end of the driveway, wearing a wrinkled polo shirt and the expression of a man who had seen too much. He must have heard the commotion and decided it was finally time to step in. His gaze flickered between Karen and the officers, then landed on me. There was something in his eyes. Not sympathy exactly, but something close to it. "Karen," Todd said, voice low. "What did you do?" Karen spun around, her eyes wild. "I was protecting the neighborhood. You should be thanking me." Todd exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "You called the cops on a disabled vet, Karen. Do you hear yourself?" The younger officer nodded. "Your wife has a history of complaints against her, sir. This is far from her first time harassing a resident." Todd didn't seem surprised. If anything, he looked resigned, like a man who had known this day was coming for a long time. He pinched the bridge of his nose and let out a long, tired sigh. "What's going to happen now?" The older officer flipped through his notepad. "At minimum, she's looking at a fine for misusing emergency services. If the victim," he gestured toward me, "decides to press charges for harassment or an ADA violation, things could get a lot more complicated." Karen whirled on Todd, gripping his arm. "You'll get me a lawyer, won't you? You'll fix this." Todd's lips pressed into a thin line and he gently removed her hand. "I think you've done enough damage on your own." The look on Karen's face was priceless. It was the face of a woman who had never truly faced consequences before. Her eyes darted around as if searching for an escape. But there was none. Not this time. One of my neighbors, an older woman named Mrs. Holloway, stepped out onto her porch, watching the scene unfold with keen interest. A few more residents followed, standing in small clusters, whispering amongst themselves. 4 months, they had lived under Karen's iron rule, forced to follow her ridiculous, ever-changing HOA guidelines. Now for the first time they were watching her fall. I decided to add one final blow. "Actually, officer, I would like to press charges." Karen let out an inhuman screech, spinning to face me. "You can't. You wouldn't." I leaned back in my wheelchair, resting my hands on the armrests. "I absolutely would." The younger officer nodded and started writing. "That settles it then." Karen turned to Todd, eyes pleading. "Do something." Todd just shook his head. "I think you've done enough." The realization that no one was going to save her finally sank in. Her shoulders slumped, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She looked smaller somehow, as if all the authority she once carried had been stripped away in an instant. The officers finished their notes and stepped back. "Ma'am, we'll be following up. Expect a notice soon." Karen didn't say another word. She just stood there, face pale, as the officers walked back to their cruiser. The younger cop gave me a slight nod as they pulled away. As soon as they were gone, the neighbors started whispering louder. A few even clapped. Mrs. Holloway approached me, her eyes twinkling with something that looked an awful lot like satisfaction. It's about time someone put that woman in her place. I smiled. Glad to be of service. The crowd dispersed slowly, neighbors exchanging glances as they walked back into their homes. But there was something different in the air now. A shift. The fear that had once kept people silent was gone. Karen wasn't untouchable anymore. Todd stood there for a moment before finally shaking his head. I should have stopped her sooner. I didn't say anything. It wasn't my place to tell him how to handle his marriage. But he already knew. Without another word, he turned and walked back inside. Karen, however, lingered. Her glare was sharp enough to cut glass, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't the HOA queen anymore. She wasn't in control. I gave her a small wave. Have a nice evening, Karen. She turned on her heel and stormed away, her heels clicking against the pavement. Rocky, sitting beside me, let out a satisfied huff. I reached down and scratched behind his ears. I think we just won, buddy. He wagged his tail. But I knew this wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't the type to go down without a fight. And I had a feeling the next few days were going to be very interesting. The sun had barely risen when I heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching my driveway. I already knew who it was before I even turned my head. Karen. Because of course she wasn't done. She stood there, arms crossed, a scowl stretched across her face like she had spent the entire night plotting her next move. Her perfectly styled hair was slightly frizzed at the edges, a rare crack in her usually polished appearance. She hadn't slept well. Good. You think you've won, don't you? She snapped, her voice low but still laced with that ever-present arrogance. I adjusted my wheelchair slightly, giving her the laziest shrug I could manage. Didn't realize this was a competition, Karen. But if it was, yeah, I'd say I'm doing pretty well. Her nostrils flared. This is far from over. I didn't even get a chance to respond before my front door swung open and Rocky came trotting out, tail wagging like he hadn't just been witness to months of harassment from this woman. Karen took an instinctive step back like she thought he was about to lunge. I rolled my eyes. The most threatening thing about Rocky was his ability to beg for snacks with his sad eyes. Relax, Karen. Rocky's not going to hurt you. I can't say the same about the legal system, though. I gave her a pointed look. Her face twisted in frustration. Do you have any idea how much damage you've caused me? My husband won't speak to me, the HOA is in chaos, and now I have a legal battle because of you. I let out a laugh. A real one. Oh, I'm sorry, was I supposed to feel bad that you're finally facing consequences for your actions? Her fingers twitched at her sides like she wanted to throw something. You're ruining everything. No, Karen, you ruined everything, a voice cut in from behind her. I looked past her and saw Todd walking up the driveway, hands in his pockets, face lined with exhaustion. He stopped a few feet away, shaking his head like a man who had been through one too many battles and was ready to surrender. Karen, I think it's time for you to step down, he said, voice firm but lacking any real anger. More like resignation. Karen whipped around, her eyes widening. Excuse me. Todd let out a heavy sigh. The HOA board had an emergency meeting last night. Now, Karen. You're no longer president. Her face drained of color. She looked between him and me like she was waiting for one of us to tell her this was a joke. But neither of us did. You can't do that, she sputtered, voice high-pitched and bordering on hysterical. Todd gave her a tired look. Actually, we can. The neighborhood voted. Unanimously. Karen took a step back, shaking her head. This is my community. I built this place. No, you ruled over it like a dictator, Todd corrected. And now, people are done. She stood there, stunned into silence for the first time since I had met her. It was honestly kind of nice. I decided to twist the knife just a little. So, Karen, what's next? Gonna call 911 on democracy? Her head snapped toward me, but there was no fire in her eyes anymore. Just panic. It was finally sinking in that she had lost. That her reign of terror was officially over. And she had no one to blame but herself. Todd sighed again and reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. And one more thing. I filed for divorce. Karen staggered back like she had been slapped. You're leaving me? Todd just nodded. This isn't the first time you've crossed the line, Karen. But it's the last. I'm done. For the second time in as many days, Karen looked truly speechless. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, but no words came out. Her whole world was crumbling, and for once, there was no one she could manipulate into saving her. The silence stretched between us until finally, with a small, choked noise, Karen turned on her heel and walked away. Not storming off like she usually did. Just walking. Defeated. Todd watched her go before shaking his head. I should have done that years ago. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? He had lived with that woman for years. He knew better than anyone what she was like. Instead, I wheeled forward and held out my hand. He looked surprised at first, but then he reached out and shook it. Guess we'll be seeing less of her around, I said, keeping my tone light. Todd chuckled, a short, tired sound. God, I hope so. He gave me a nod before turning and walking away. And just like that, the storm that had been plaguing my life for months had finally passed. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood transformed. The HOA, now under new leadership, actually started focusing on things that mattered instead of enforcing ridiculous, power-hungry rules. The fake violations stopped. People started openly walking their dogs without fear. Someone even put up a small community library in their yard, something Karen had previously banned for being unsightly. As for Karen, she put her house up for sale. Rumor had it she was moving to a different neighborhood. One where she could start over, maybe even try to regain the control she lost. But somehow I doubted things would ever be the same for her. One afternoon, as I sat on my porch with Rocky lying lazily at my feet, Mrs. Holloway walked by, a cup of tea in hand. She gave me a knowing smile. You know, I think you did us all a favor, she said. I chuckled. Didn't really plan on taking down an HOA president when I moved in. She laughed, shaking her head. Life's funny like that. I watched as she walked away, feeling something I hadn't felt since moving into this neighborhood. Peace. Actual, genuine peace. Rocky let out a content sigh, resting his head on his paws. Yeah, buddy, I muttered, scratching behind his ears. I think we're finally home.